Hi, I'm Blake Rayhans.
And I'm Stacie Mallon.
And you are listening to the Optimized AF podcast.
We know life is hard. We're here to make it simple.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Optimized AF podcast. My name is Blake.
And I'm Stacie. And we are continuing. We left you on a cliffhanger last time. But probably
pins and needles, I would assume.
I'm sure people were just
such a cliffhanger,
chomping at the bit for the second part.
Yeah, we got to work on that.
On how to really launch into a really valuable coaching conversation. And we are, again, to refresh your memory, for those of you on our video, we are talking about the coaching habit. And this specific topic is really the very first question, which is we're going to start by talking about the Kickstarter question, what they call the Kickstarter question. And I do think as we role played, I would say it gave us like a C on our role play. Maybe Nick can chime in. I think it was probably not. It
was a C plus
C
at least. At least.
Lazy.
Yeah, lazy.
Oh, well, wow. It is a Friday afternoon, so.
Okay. Wow. How about that? Tell us how you really feel. I feel like you're holding back.
So the Kickstarter question that really to lead off the episode the question is, what's on your mind? And it sounds like such an easy question. And isn't it the same thing that we started with last time? And the answer is not at all. I think the reason why this is a powerful question, in my opinion, I'm not saying this is the book's opinion, but I think what's on your mind opens the door to really get the person to understand the person's kind of frame, like mindset in the moment. And I think as a coach, one of the more powerful things to assess in the very first part of a coaching conversation is what is the mindset of the person and where is their head at and what are they considering and what is feeling heavy to them and is it that like we've talked about in our lives, is it something that has something to do with their kiddos? Because very realistically, when you have children, if they're struggling, that's probably more top of mind than anything else for you. Or is it something that's specifically related to a project? What is it specifically? And we're going to break down this question a little bit into the three major elements that we usually start to help people dive into. Is it really about projects? Is that what's on your mind? Is it people or is it patterns? And so that's the deep dive into the first question, but it's really what's on your mind is the best place to start.
Yeah, and as a coach, the thing you got to be prepared for is, of course, the floodgates opening up, right? The potential is that it could be anything around those people. It could be patterns. It could be anything. In a lot of cases, the rapport that you've built with that person is going to dictate, I think in many cases, how willing they are to open up those floodgates. But when you have a great rapport, be fair, fair warning. Like you're going to get everything that's on their mind. So you're, as a coach, it is your job to get down to really what matters most. Really what is the thing that is the thing that keeps them up at night, right? I love that saying. Jack Welch has used it in terms of how he looks at strategy when he works with companies and what you should ask a leadership team in order to plan what should we really get out in front of, what keeps you up at night. Well, the same thing applies to anybody on your team. If they have something of the, let's call it 13 things that they share with you, there's likely something that when you frame it in the, the kind of like what wakes you up in the middle of the night, figuratively, maybe they don't, but that's the most important thing. But you don't get it from the first pass. First pass, you either get something higher level, more broad, or you get 13 things and it's kind of mixed in with everything else that's noise, but it's not really driving their behavior.
Yeah. And I think for me, in especially coaching where we are right now in 2020, 2021, which is we're on web calls many times or even phone calls. And I've done a lot of my coaching virtually from across the United States anyway. So this is great because if I'm with someone, sort of how they show up and their kind of frame of mind is more obvious than it is when you're coaching from the perspective of, as leaders right now, many times, I'm on a Teams call or a Zoom call, and sometimes people don't have their camera on and sometimes they do, but it's still harder to get a sense for how people are feeling in that moment than it is in person. So I also think for those of you who are leading distributed teams or teams remotely, given where your business stands on coming back into the office, or if you're never going to come back into the office, this is a very valuable question to get a sense for how someone's feeling and where they're at in the moment, because you can't tell like you would in an in-person.
That's right. Yeah. And then, so in the book, they talk about, well, the first question is the kickstart question. It's the way you should start a conversation. Our role play in the last episode was how a lot of times leaders approach this. It's chit chat, it's small talk, it's I'm trying to relate to you. But what the book says is that you really ought to just jump right into it. There's no point in making it anything that it doesn't need to be. This is a coaching conversation. What's on your mind? The next thing they go into immediately is, now you got to dig deeper. Because the first thing anybody gives you is never going to be, like I said before, the main thing. So the next one is, and it sounds so simple, and what else?
Yep, the awe.
The awe, A-W-E. And what else?
Mm-hmm.
And we talked in the last episode, again, if your team gets used to you saying, what's on your mind? And what else? And what else? And they know you're going to keep pushing them to think deeper. You got to figure out your own style. But for the purpose of the episode, we're going off of based on, exactly how the book has it. And what else? It forces the person to think deeper, more deeply. It forces them to say, is there something else that I'm not sharing? And here's the most awkward part for a coach. And this is where most of us, and I'll lump myself into this category because I have done this in the past. The moment of silence is very uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable more for the coach than it is the person receiving the coaching. Because as a coach, more than likely you're in that position because you probably have the answer. You probably have the advice, but you cannot give it to them. You have to sit there and say, and what else? And then sit in silence, and you have to wait, because that level of uncomfortable 3 seconds, which seems like an eternity, it will force that person to then think more about what they shared and say, you know what, and this other thing. And maybe that's not even the most important. Maybe sometimes you have to do it a third time. And then you finally get down to really, where is the value that I can bring to you by bringing that thing that you've sort of covered up to the surface so that we can deal with it.
Yeah. And I told Blake when we were prepping for this episode, I saw this is on page 59 of the book. It says, you tame the advice monster. And it says, if this were a haiku rather than a book, it would read, tell less and ask more. Your advice is not as good as you think it is. So I thought, if I had $1 for every leader who just launched in that uncomfortable silence into a diatribe about their own personal history and situation. And again, I'm very guilty of that as well. I think it can be very uncomfortable. Let's just talk about 2020 as a great example. People were in a lot of pain. And I think sometimes if you said, what's on your mind, and we had lots of leaders, I know you and I were both coaching leaders in 2020. I had lots of leaders say, I don't really want to know, because I feel like if I ask, I think I told you I was, Blake and I were talking about this a lot when I was coaching a group of engineers, literal rocket scientists. And many times I get on a call with them, and I would start the call with, we were trying to apply, there was more accountability coaching. They were trying to apply some of these skills as leaders. And so one of them got on the phone with me one time and said, I'm never doing that again, because one of his team members just unloaded all the things right at his feet. And he said, I didn't even know what to say. I didn't know how to respond. I felt terrible. She started tearing up and crying. And here's what I heard a lot of in 2020. I think we talked about this on an early episode. People were very emotionally raw, and still are, by the way, in 2021. And so sometimes people are just back to back calls. So when you have a coaching call with that person, and if you're the very first person to ask them, maybe in days because they're homeschooling right behind them with their children and their spouse is 2 rooms over. So the spouse feels like they know what's going on with the person. So they're not asking how they're doing because they're in the same environment. This feels like this is happening all over the place. And if you're the very first person to ask that person what's on your mind, you may get a lot in return to that question and then when you ask, and what else? Because they may give you the nice, safe answer to start. And then when you say, and what else? And they really start to feel like this person's listening to me and they care about me and they want to hear my answer, you may surface some emotion. So again, this coaching habit is not right for every single person. But I think it's a very powerful way. We've talked about this before, to help people feel seen and heard. And I think now more than ever, people are not feeling seen or heard because it is just a marathon of Zoom calls and being pushed and pulled in 1,000 directions.
Yeah, and I want to touch on something here because I want to make the point very clear that it is okay to step out of the coaching hat. Like we talk about the multiple hats that people wear, right? And I do this from time to time where I'll literally tell the person, I say, look, I'm kind of going to step away from the coaching thing for a minute. I'm going to become a mentor. Like I just need to step in and tell you what I think you should do. There will be moments of that. But I think the book has the advice, and I know Stacie, you and I are both on the same page, that you should refrain from, as the book puts it, the advice monster when you're trying to coach someone. But you're the person that knows the receiving end, the person on the receiving end of your coaching. You're the one who knows them best in this situation. You're going to know what they need. You're going to know what's going to bring the most value. And in certain instances, you do need to just step in and say, look, here's something you're going through, something that, maybe firsthand I have been through. And you're struggling to come up with an answer. I maybe asked you a series of questions and you're just not, you talk about the, leading a person to water, right? Or whatever the case is. The necessity for you to step in is a case-by-case basis, but it does happen. It's not to say the keep your advice monster at bay that the book describes is not to say that you're not allowed to ever give someone a solution.
I think asking the person, again, going back to a question, would it be helpful if I shared my own experience with you? Would it be helpful if I shared with you some things from other folks that I've heard this week? Would it be helpful? So I think you can kind of bridge that into really asking for permission. And most of the time, I think most people are like, yeah, I need a timeout. So just, give me a bit of a lifeline. And I think the magic of coaching as a coach, the best thing about coaching actually has everything to do with what it does for your own personal development as a coach. Because one, it is all about listening. And to go back to Scott's episode that we had, I don't remember which episode number it was, but we can kind of cross post this, but he gave us this great analogy about viewing every experience and interaction like a traveler. When you're in this mindset of a coach, we talked about last episode, you're on the sidelines, you're not in the game, you're not going to do it for the person. I think another great analogy and mindset to be in is being very curious and really diving in and being curious about what the person is saying, how they're saying it, being mindful of sort of their tone, being mindful of the words that they're using, really paying attention, studying, for the benefit of the person in front of you, being curious about exactly what they're saying and how they're phrasing it, and even what they're saying in this cascade of and what else, and what else. Where are they going in that journey of answering those questions? And, again, it's called a coaching habit because it takes time. And I think as you develop this habit, you'll start to see patterns, not just with specific individuals, which you do. This is something that as coaches, you learn pretty quickly that people pattern kind of into that conversation pretty naturally for themselves. And as you become more comfortable, you can kind of push them a little bit out of that comfort zone. But also, there are sort of archetypal patterns that people also sort of fall into. And I'll be honest, I had a bunch of one-on-ones this week, and this is something I've seen in my career quite a bit of. So the way that men kind of navigate that Q&A and the way women sometimes, and I'm not saying this is a universal truth, but I'll say this to some degree is kind of broadly based in my experience. Men typically, for me, seem to be more open. Now, it'd be interesting to know for you, because there is a female to female, male to female dynamic here.
Yeah, I wondered if you were going to go there, because it is. I think the dynamic between who, the age, the gender. I mean, we talk about some of the most basic high level demographics about a person and how they relate to the other person, right? So, for example, when you're the coach and the person you're coaching is older than you, there's already a barrier you got to work through of like, well, I've lived through experiences you never have, so how am I possibly? But here's the thing: I think it still goes back to people's perception of what a coach is there for, is in a large way still anchored in they are there to give me advice. They have to have had absolutely no question. There's no kind of flexing on this at all. They have to have had gone through the same things I've gone through.
Yes,
or else there's no possible way they can coach me.
I think
you're missing the point. The point
I think you might be reflecting on someone.
Possibly.
Yeah.
But the point is that you are not, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, you're not that fucking unique.
Yeah.
Okay, great. You've got some unique experiences that are unique to you. I'm sorry, that's great. But that does not mean that somebody who hasn't done the things that you've done can't lead you through a path and a journey. I'll label the questions, because again, we're talking about how coaching is about questions. Coaching is about getting somebody to think a different way. Somebody can lead you through a journey that has you on your own arrive at a place that allows you to work through a solution, come up with a better idea than you ever had before, overcome a challenge, and the list goes on and on and on. And that person sitting across the table from you or across the Zoom call that's asking those questions could have never experienced any of the same experiences that you've experienced.
Yeah. And I think this comes up a lot. And we talked about this on the last episode, that life coaching became a big trendy thing. And, there were a lot of 20-something life coaches kind of popping up, and, people would ask me about that or talk to me about that. And, it's more mindset and emotional intelligence and willingness to listen with curiosity. And it's more of a mindset and sort of a dynamic, and dare I say, just sort of the energy that somebody brings to an interaction versus somebody's straight up experience. I will say there's some validity to, you and I have both led people before. There's some element of coaching in a business realm that when you've had direct experience, sometimes better questions to ask because
Certainly.
You've been in that circumstance previously, or at least once or twice. So I think there's some reference point, and we talk about this. We have this conversation a lot in my household because, of course, my household is full of Gen Zs, and they know how to Google everything. So therefore, by default, they know how to do everything, and that your experience is not valuable whatsoever because they clearly can figure it out on YouTube. So I will say with coaching that there is some element sometimes when you're working with someone that, it comes into play that a question comes to me and helping them kind of dig a little bit deeper, just having been in that circumstance myself.
Certainly.
So I'm not really conveying my experience, but it does help me guide. But I think there's a point, to your point, of if you've been in a leadership role before, if you've worked in a few different environments, I think that's enough relative experience where somebody can be a powerful coach. And powerful coaches, Tony Robbins is probably the most powerful, well-known coach in the world. He uses very specific coaching tactics and strategies, and actually neuro-linguistic programming is a function that he uses for his coaching. Which is very popular, but nobody wants to talk about it. It's like black magic. And I think that what's interesting is I've really interacted with quite a few people that have learned NLP. I've interacted with a lot of people who call themselves coaches. I've interacted with a lot of people in fitness who identify as life coaches. over and above being a fitness coach. So I feel like I've in the last probably 5 years, you and I have met a lot of people from ICF, the International Coaching Federation. And I will say, there's that coach is probably right for someone. So there's sort of a universal truth that there's probably a match out there for everyone. But I will say there are some people that are more naturally gifted at coaching that I've watched. And I will say, to Blake's credit, when I first met Blake, and we first had a conversation, Blake's skill set early on in working with Blake, it was very clear to me that Blake is more of a natural coach than a lot of the people that we were working with at the time. And it's probably had a lot to do with the fact that Blake and I, as we were working with folks, we developed great rapport with the teams that we were working with. And so we were getting great results as coaches. Again, not as mentors, different thing. And we had some folks there who are great mentors on that team. But I do think but it is a coaching habit you can develop over time. But I will admit there is some intrinsic sort of energy and skill set and history that I think makes it easier for some people than others.
It does. You're absolutely right. And what got us on that particular topic of it, we were talking about the dynamic between, maybe a male coach to a female recipient or vice versa, or the age demographic. And so that all plays together. That all plays, in the same sandbox of how somebody's going to receive the coaching. So I guess the thing for the leaders out there to listen to is that the team you have is the team you have. And you need to, as a leader, be the chameleon. The idea here is that your coaching methodology, your approach to how you lead, and what we're doing in these episodes is talking about the methodology of coaching and the approach to doing more of a questions than giving advice. That still is catered to each person on your team. That's the job of a leader. And if you don't believe that, we can have a conversation about it. But the reality is that everybody on your team is not there as a function of their job to change the way they are to the way you are. Yeah. It is the opposite.
Yeah,
I'll be very clear, that's my opinion,
so
but I
true.
believe it is, and I will have any number of debates about this. As a leader, it is your job to cater yourself and your approach to each of the individual personalities that are on your team. No question.
And as you walk away from this episode, and again, we're going to tease into the final episode of this, which is like coaching, next level coaching sort of. But in the next week, I would encourage you to practice this. So as you're having coaching sessions with folks, the first takeaway is what's on your mind, just leading with that question, seeing and testing out how people respond to that question. It can be very interesting when you first try this, kind of how different people respond and react to that. So use it as like you're running an experiment. That's the whole curiosity factor that we talked about. And then next level is, okay, and what else? And so I think this is something we've talked about before, using and instead of but when you're talking about something. So as somebody goes down that road, helping them dive deeper by just asking the follow-up question, and what else? You might have to go 3 or 4 layers in. Granted. So I think that it's just a great thing to practice over the next week before we get to episode 3, which is really getting to the next level of how you can level up on your coaching skill. Yeah.
So please, come back for next week's episode where we take it to the next level. But try what Stacie has kind of given you as an exercise, and just keep in mind, like we talked about, the most uncomfortable part of that exercise is going to be for you to sit in silence and wait for the answer. So just be mindful of that when you go through this, and fight off that advice monster and let the coachee give a response. And that little, 2 to 5 seconds is going to seem like an eternity, but I want to just leave you with that as a reminder. That's the real job that you have in this exercise, is staying quiet after you've asked the question.
Yes, that's great advice. So we will end there, and we will see you next week. Hey guys, thanks for listening to our show. You can find Blake and I on social media channels at Blake Rayhans and at Stacie Mallon.
Be sure to follow Optimized AF on Instagram, and rate and subscribe to this podcast on iTunes. See you next time.